Good morning, sisters and brothers. I want to welcome you to an urban adventure. In this first segment, I'd like you to imagine a world in motion. The southern hemisphere is coming north, east is coming west, and everybody's coming to Dallas. Everybody's coming to Los Angeles, to New York. It turns out that we have over 400 cities now of 1 million or more people. And those cities are functioning globally like gigantic magnets, sucking the nations into the neighborhoods. And in this first segment, I want to talk about that world, that big picture. 1800, 2% of God's earth lived in sizable cities. 1900, 8% of this planet lived in sizable cities. But 3 years ago, in fact, it was the second week of October, the UN said the world shifted. Maybe you felt it, tectonic shift. The majority of the world's 6 billion people now live in sizable cities. As a matter of fact, the urban population today is bigger than the entire world's population the year I was born. In effect, it's the greatest migration in human history. It's hard to explain, but I think those of you in the US will have some idea. But it's happening all over the world. And so let me paint a big picture. It'll be the setting. We'll come back to it and look at some of the closer in photos of how that plays out in our own communities. Let me start with New York. If you were to get off the airplane in New York today at one of the airports, I would take you to Flushing, which is in Queens. In fact, if you've ever watched the Mets baseball or if you've ever watched the National Tennis Finals, about a mile from that tennis stadium is a place called Flushing. A couple years ago, the New York Times discovered and published in an essay that there were 133 nations living together in one zip code. Now that, so far as I know, is the highest international presence of any zip code in the country. Now there are about 200 nations in the world. To have 2/3 of the world's nations represented in one postal zone is really quite incredible, and that tells what's happened. I moved in 1965 with my young family into inner city Chicago, and in our square mile, we had 60,000 people. When I put my 3 sons in school, I was surprised to discover in an inner city high school of 2,500 students, they were teaching in 11 languages. There were 63 nations in the student body. Now this is one inner city public school. That school had more than 1/4 of the world's nations in our 1 mile square community. That's when I began to ask the question, what is God doing? God is urbanizing the world, and God is internationalizing the cities. And that's when I began to look at cities differently. In the US, we'd become used to thinking of the city as the poor place, the inner city as a metaphor for poverty, and the suburbs as the rich. In fact, we talked about the white flight and the white fright, the running away from the city, which happened in our country largely in the cities. But I need to remind you that in the rest of the world, this is not the way it works. The biggest cities in the world don't have a black-white problem. They're neither black nor white. They're yellow and brown. So this idea of race as the defining reality of city is limited. The idea of poverty as a defining reality is limited. What seems to be characterizing a definition of city now is that the cities are the catch basins of the nations. We're shifting gradually and now increasingly rapidly from a world of roughly 200 nations to a world of internationally connected city-states. In fact, Saskia Sassen, a Princeton professor, says the world has a triangle like a 3-legged stool. Tokyo and London and New York sit like a giant colossus over this planet. The world has been rewired financially around these 3 poles. And these 3 poles straddle the 6 continents. And outside of those axis of three are the secondary financial centers around the world, which are shaping and changing the way this world lives. I want to take you on a fast trip around the U.S. just so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's leave New York and go to Detroit, the Arab capital of the United States. Perhaps some of you know this, but Dearborn and Detroit are host to more than 250,000 Arabs. In fact, since Americans are now interested in Iraq, and many are over there in the military, I just want to remind you, Detroit is the Iraqi capital of the United States. There are at least 50,000 Iraqi Christians in Detroit. That's a surprise to many Americans, that many of the Iraqis in this country are not Muslims at all. They're Chaldean Catholics, or they're Assyrian, which is North Iraq, Assyrian Presbyterians, Iraqis in our cities. Chicago had about 40,000 of them. Love to take you to Pittsburgh. If you come through the tunnel from the airport and you look at the Golden Triangle where the Ohio River comes together, the two rivers that form the Ohio, you're looking out over the Golden Triangle. Look off into the distance and see all the onion dome churches. What's that about? It's the capital of Serbia. 60,000 Serbs in southwest Pennsylvania. Extraordinary, isn't it? I think so. Chicago, until very recently, had more Polish people than Warsaw. In fact, there are still 100,000 more Polish people in Chicago than San Francisco has people. That's hard to believe. San Francisco has 740,000 people in the city limits. Chicago has 840,000 Polish people. And for a time, Chicago was the capital of Poland, actually. In fact, Chicago functions for Poland much like New York functions for Israel. You see, these cities leverage one another globally. The migrant streams in and out are the new ways to think about mission. The world is webbed now in very different directions than it was a few years ago. In my lifetime, the country has changed. We were, when I was a kid, a nation facing the Atlantic. But slowly, like a swinging door, the United States is a nation facing the Pacific. 60% of God's earth is in the Pacific. And so we now have a Pacific rim, and then some add a Pacific basin. That's a metaphor for the poverty in East Asia. So it's a rim and basin phenomenon. But about 25% of God's earth is in the Pacific rim. So the West Coast is no longer the back door of Europe. The West Coast is the front door of Asia. That's hugely significant as you see our country in the future. I think most of you know that the United States has long been the largest Irish nation in the world. There are far more Irish here than in Ireland. I think you know that we're by far the largest Jewish nation in the world. We have far more Jews in New York City than the whole state of Israel. And Miami's Jewish population is larger than Tel Aviv's Jewish population. And Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. Did you know, though, we now have more Arabs than Jews in the United States? So we've long been a large Jewish nation, but now we're becoming a large Arab nation. 23 countries in the Arab world, but we're rapidly becoming one of the most populous Arab countries. The United States has long been the largest Scandinavian nation. Far more Scandinavians here than Scandinavia. This won't be a surprise to anybody in Texas, but we're now the third largest Spanish-speaking nation. There are 25 Spanish-speaking nations in the world, but only Mexico and Spain, and Mexico will be here tomorrow, only Mexico and Spain have larger Spanish language populations than the United States. A couple years ago, I was asked to speak at the Mayor's Prayer Breakfast in Anchorage, Alaska. I think for most of you, Anchorage will be a synonym of ice bowl or somewhere near the North Pole. It's not quite there, but we did a survey in preparation for my being there. We studied Anchorage, and we got the demographics, and we were surprised. The fastest growing group in Anchorage, Alaska is Mexican. At the rate the Mexicans are growing in Anchorage, they will outnumber Aleuts and Eskimos, native Alaskans, by 2020. It's extraordinary. I keep asking, does God know about this? I wish I could take you on a tour of Canada. The same thing is happening, even a little faster. You know that city across the border from Seattle, Vancouver? It's true. It's Hong Kong West. And if I could, I would take you now on a fast trip of Europe. I'd love to take you on a tour of London. I'd take you to the East End, off the tourist map, down the Thames River to Tower Hamlets or Newham, Isle of Dogs, beautiful part of London, but not well known. Guess what? It's pretty much Asian today. If I took you to the center of London and we went straight south from Bermondsey down past the Oval Cricket Ground, down to Clapham, it's pretty much black. Ugandan, West Indian, Jamaican. If I took you outside the Palace District, Westminster, or the Theatre District, Soho, it's pretty much Arab. 52 nations in the British Empire. Sun never set on it. They were so proud of it. Now all 52 nations are in London. I call it the Empire Strikes Back syndrome. The British aren't ready for this. There are now more Muslims in mosques than Baptists and Methodists and churches combined. The mission has come in reverse. I'd love to give you a tour of Amsterdam, 700-year-old city on the canals. Amsterdam ruled the Malacca Straits for 300 years. Indonesia. But now 20% of Amsterdam is Indonesian. Love to take you to Paris, one of my favorite walking cities. Paris ruled 46 French-speaking countries, 26 of which are in African, for about 150 years. They didn't pay much attention in France to this. Well, you heard about the French Foreign Legion. 150 years the French were influencing. Guess what? Paris, which is now the largest city in Europe, larger than London, larger than Moscow, is 14% Algerian in France. Marseille, the size of Metro Dallas, on the Riviera, is 31% African in France. And a new racism is arising in France, and it influenced this last election there, you may remember. Love to take you on a tour of Germany. 100 years ago, as part of a policy of Dragnak-Osten, the push to the east, the Germans built railroads to the Bosporus, to Turkey. Guess what? Hundreds of thousands of Turkish guest workers now live in every city in Germany. I could give you the tour of Berlin, Mainz, Hamburg, Wuppertal, down the Rhine River through Cologne. That whole Rhine River is becoming foreign to Germany. It's quite surprising, and to some, many, alarming. This isn't just true of the West. 1 million Japanese live in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I mean, you can't get further apart on this planet than North Pacific Japan and South Atlantic Brazil. How does that happen? How do 1 million Japanese end up in one Brazilian city? 140 million Chinese live outside China. How do you explain that? People track this. Missions have been thinking, how do we get the gospel into China? We've been trying it since the first mission left Baghdad in 615 and took the Silk Road in. There have been 4 great attempts to get the gospel into China by the churches over the centuries. Well, we've been thinking, how do we reach 20% of the world in China? The Lord of history is spinning the Chinese out. And they are one of the top 10 nations of the world are the Chinese living outside China. And they're in every one of our cities, the Chinatowns. Could this be an accident? Does God know about any of this? We did a survey of Buenos Aires. You can't get much further south, in South America than that. Guess what? 10% of the churches' first language in Buenos Aires is Korean. A tithe of the churches in Buenos Aires, Argentina, speak Korean as a first language. I could go on and on to show you the world is in motion. And that world means that we have the greatest migration in human history going on right now. You add an exploding birth rate of 3 to 4%, an in-migration of 3 to 4%, you've got cities in Africa, Latin America, and Asia that are doubling in little more than a decade. It's huge birth control, and then pile on that the in-migration. It means that every place is becoming peasantized in some sense, but every place has become pluralized because the people who come into the cities are coming with sending culture baggage. This is creating a world very different from the world we have known. Mission in the past was always crossing the ocean, crossing the desert, getting to those unreached peoples. And in the past, that always meant geographical distance. Today, they're coming here at their own expense. It's the greatest bargain in world mission. Just when it's expensive to send missionaries there, they come here. The nations are now in the neighborhoods. The challenge is not geographical distance, it's cultural distance. The cultures of the world are often within the shadows of the spires of our churches. It's huge. It's different. It's on all 6 continents. If you know the population of China, if you can even imagine 20% of the world is Chinese. What does China have to do with Canada? Let me just try to get your head around something that's happening. There are 30 million people in Canada. 30 million people. Huge country, 30 million people. Every single year, 30 million people move from rural to urban China. If you can get your head around this, it's entire Canada leaves every year and moves. That is the migration inside China. A similar scaled migration is happening in India. As these countries race to the future, the cities are the magnets pulling people in from the rural areas. This is happening all over the planet. It's intra and inter. So that mission is now to, in, and from all 6 continents. Well, does the Lord know anything about this? I've been thinking about that myself a little bit. And I came across a psalm. You'll recognize the opening. Praise the Lord. Oh, give thanks to the Lord for his good, for his mercy endures forever. This is Psalm 107. Those are very familiar words. Who can utter the mighty acts of God? I'm sorry, Psalm 107. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from the hand of the enemy, and gathered out of the lands from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. They wandered in the wilderness in a desolate way. They found no city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted in them. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses. He led them forth by the right way, that they might go to a city to dwell in. As I reflect on that, I know this passage came to pass when the exiles returned to Jerusalem. But it's now coming to pass every single day. As people get on those airplanes and cross the oceans, the cities are both the magnets drawing the nations into them and the magnifiers sending influences out to the rural areas from them. A city is like a woofer and a tweeter of an amplifier system. It sucks in the resources of the nations. It sucks in the peoples into the places. And then, remarkably, the city becomes a stage prop for propagating those values out into the culture. So it's a dynamic, ever-changing situation. It seems to me that people who move into the city, who get almost overwhelmed by this change that is happening in their neighborhood, need at some point to see this bigger picture. The bigger picture is that God is urbanizing the world. God is internationalizing cities. The United States has become the catch basin of the nations. And even more so, Canada has joined us in this. And on all 6 continents, it's out of control. A few years ago, there were 18 cities of 1 million or more in Africa. Today, there are 96, according to a Catholic scholar, Aylward Shorter. The fastest growing cities in the world are in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's a new day. It's a new day for urban ministry when the cities need to be seen as the R&D units for the church, not the left behinds or the people we should feel sorry for. We should be interested in the city today because the city is prophetically what the rural areas are going to be tomorrow. The city is where the cultures change first. It's like a time-lapse camera. It's all of reality speeded up. So we need to pay attention to urban ministry today, because if you want to know what's happening in rural society tomorrow, you're going to be seeing it today. So let me remind you one more time. God is rewiring the world, moving the world from a rather static number of nation states to a world of dynamically interconnected large cities. And this changes a lot of things for us. This changes the way we look at mission and church. The fastest growing churches now, and 80% of the Christians, are outside the West. It does mean that they will be in the heart of the fastest growing set of cities. It means that those of us who have a history of urban ministry in the West need to see ourselves as brokers and resource sharers into the future. We will be needed because the missions community, which went to jungles, doesn't have a lot to say except in spiritual discipline. They don't have a lot of the technology. Those of you who've worked in American cities and North American cities know that what we have been learning is now needed in every city in the developing world. And so it's a strategic time for us. The world's being rewired. For some reason, God, who is interested in a commission that said we should disciple all the nations, is now bringing the nations into the cities where we can reach them. This is the world God is making. And my contention is that if you understand then the city, you'll be able to read the world.